The cold came up through the floor first. That's what Elijah Crane learned in his first winter at the headwaters of the Yellowstone, 1837. Not through the walls, not through the gaps in the doorframe, but up through the floorboards, through the soles of his moccasins, through the layers of wool socks he'd wrapped his feet in, straight into the bones of his feet, like iron nails driven slow and relentless. By January, he couldn't feel his toes anymore. By February, the skin on his heels had cracked open in fissures that wept and refused to heal. And by early March, when the worst of the blizzards came howling down from the mountains, Elijah knew that if he didn't solve this problem, he'd lose his feet. And a man without feet in the high country wasn't a man at all. He was a dead man who just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Elijah had built his cabin the way every trapper built cabins in those mountains. He'd felled lodgepole pines, notched them tight, chinked the gaps with moss and clay. He'd split planks for the floor, laid them directly on log joists that rested on stones he'd set into the earth. It was the standard method, the proven method, the way trappers and mountain men had been building shelters since they first pushed into these ranges. The walls kept out the wind. The roof kept out the snow. The door, when barred shut, kept out the wolves and the occasional grizzly that hadn't denned up properly. Every other part of the cabin did its job, but that floor, that cursed floor, might as well have been made of ice itself. The problem wasn't the wood. Elijah had chosen good, tight-grained pine, dried it as best he could through the short autumn. The problem wasn't even his craftsmanship. He'd fitted those boards together with the patience of a man who knew his life depended on his work. No, the problem was that 6 inches beneath those floorboards, beneath those joists, beneath those foundation stones, was the earth itself. And at 8,000 feet in the Rockies, in the dead of winter, that earth was frozen solid to a depth of 3 feet or more, frozen harder than granite, frozen so cold that it radiated that cold upward like a malevolent spirit reaching for the living. During the day, when Elijah kept his fire roaring, when he fed it constantly with split wood, the air in the cabin would warm, the walls would warm, even the roof beams would lose their coating of frost. But the floor, that floor, never warmed, not truly. Oh, standing directly in front of the fire, you could feel some heat beneath your feet, a ghost of warmth that lasted about as long as hope in a losing game of cards. But step 3 feet away from that fire, and the cold came surging back up through the planks like water through the hull of a sinking ship. The wood itself felt like stone to the touch. Frost formed in the cracks between the boards. On the worst mornings, when the temperature outside dropped to 40 below or worse, Elijah would wake to find a thin rime of ice crystals covering the entire floor and his feet so numb that he had to drag himself to the fire like a cripple. He tried everything the old-timers had taught him. He laid down bear hides with the fur still on, thick and luxurious. The cold came right through them. He layered elk skins on top of the bear hides. Still the cold persisted. He tried sleeping in his boots, but that just trapped the moisture from his feet, and by morning his toes were encased in damp leather that felt colder than if he'd gone barefoot. He tried keeping the fire blazing all night, feeding it every hour, but even that was a fool's bargain. The moment he'd drift back to sleep, the fire would die down, and the cold would come creeping back across that floor like a living thing, patient and inevitable. By the time February arrived, Elijah was in trouble, real trouble. He'd been trapping this country for 3 seasons, and he knew the signs. The tips of 2 toes on his left foot had gone white and waxy. Frostbite in its early stages. Another few weeks, and he'd start losing tissue. Another month, and he'd be looking at amputation if he even survived long enough to make it down to a trading post where someone had the tools and the whiskey to perform such an operation. He'd seen men lose toes, lose feet, lose entire legs to the cold. He'd seen what happened to them afterward. Some made it out of the mountains, most didn't. A trapper who couldn't walk his trap lines was a dead man. Simple as that. And here was the bitter irony that kept Elijah awake at night, staring at the dark beams of his ceiling. His cabin was actually too warm everywhere else. Come summer, when the high country finally thawed, when the short growing season exploded into life, that same cabin became an oven. The thick log walls that kept out the winter cold also trapped the summer heat. The low ceiling that helped hold warmth in winter made the space suffocating in July. There was no balance, no middle ground. His shelter was a prison of extremes, a place that tried to freeze him half the year and roast him the other half. And all because of one fundamental flaw in the design that everyone used, everyone accepted, everyone simply endured as the price of living in this country. But Elijah Crane hadn't come to the high country to endure. He'd come to thrive. He was 26 years old, lean and hard from 3 years of trap lines and pack strings, and he'd be damned if he'd let something as simple as a floor defeat him. There were men who accepted the world as it was, and there were men who looked at the world, and I asked why it couldn't be different. Elijah was the second kind. It was what had brought him west in the first place, fleeing a life in Pennsylvania that felt like a cage. And it was what would either save him or kill him in these mountains. The answer, when it started to come to him, began not with human knowledge, but with observation, with watching, with paying attention to what the land itself was trying to teach him. Because the thing about the frontier, the thing that separated the men who survived from the men who died, was that the frontier was always teaching. Every animal, every plant, every stone and stream was a lesson if you had the patience to learn it. And Elijah, lying awake at night with his feet wrapped in every scrap of wool and fur he owned, started to pay attention in a new way. He started with the animals. When the blizzards came, when the wind screamed down from the peaks and the temperature plummeted to depths that killed exposed flesh in minutes, where did the animals go? The elk moved down into the valleys, true, seeking the slightly warmer air and the wind-sheltered meadows. But what about the small creatures, the ones who couldn't migrate? The marmots, the pikas, the ground squirrels? They went underground. They burrowed. They created spaces between themselves and the frozen earth, little chambers of air that their body heat could warm. They didn't try to live on the surface. They knew better. And there was something else he noticed, something he'd seen but never really understood until now. The Shoshone, when they made their winter camps, didn't build their lodges directly on the ground the way white men built their cabins. They dug down first, not deep, maybe 6 inches, sometimes a foot. They created a shallow pit for the floor of the lodge, and then they built up from there. At first, Elijah had thought this was just about getting below the wind, creating a more sheltered space. But now he realized there was something more to it. By digging down, by creating that space, they were putting a layer of air between the frozen surface of the earth and the floor where people would walk and sit and sleep. Air that could be warmed, air that would insulate. But Elijah couldn't just dig a pit in his cabin. The floor was already built, the structure already standing. Tearing everything down and starting over wasn't an option, not with winter already deep and vicious. He needed a solution he could implement now in the middle of February with limited materials and limited time. He needed to work with what he had. And that's when he started thinking about the opposite problem. Instead of digging down, what if he built up? What if he created a space beneath his floor, a gap between the floorboards and the frozen earth? The idea seemed insane at first. Every instinct told him that raising the floor would just create a pocket for cold air to pool, would make the problem worse, not better. But then he remembered something else he'd observed. In the autumn, before the first snows came, he'd sometimes check his traps in the early morning and find them coated in frost, thick and white. But the beaver lodges in the ponds, those were never frosted. The domed structures the beavers built, with their underwater entrances and their hollow interiors, stayed warm enough that no frost formed on the outside. And why? Because the beavers had created a space, an air pocket, between the frozen water and their living quarters. The air, trapped and still, acted as a barrier. It was the same principle as why a man wrapped in a single thick blanket wasn't as warm as a man wrapped in 2 thinner blankets with an air gap between them. The air itself was the insulator. But there was a catch, and Elijah knew it. For air to insulate, it had to be still. If you just created an empty space beneath the floor, the cold air would circulate through it, would move and flow, and bring the cold right back up through the floorboards. He needed to trap the air, divide it, make it still. He needed something beneath the floor that would create thousands of small pockets, each one holding a tiny amount of air that couldn't move, couldn't flow, couldn't carry the cold. For 3 days and nights, Elijah thought about this problem while he ran his trap lines, while he scraped hides, while he fed his fire, and tried to coax feeling back into his feet. He thought about what materials he had available, what he could gather even in the dead of winter. He couldn't get grass that was long buried under snow. He couldn't get clay or mud that was frozen solid. But there was one thing he had in abundance, one thing that littered the forest floor beneath the drifts of snow, one thing he could gather by the armload: pine needles. Millions and millions of pine needles, dried and brown, layered deep beneath the trees where the wind couldn't scatter them. Pine needles weren't just fuel for starting fires, though that's all Elijah had ever used them for. Pine needles were nature's own insulation. Each needle was thin, narrow, designed to shed snow and ice. But packed together, they created a mat of tiny air spaces, thousands of little gaps where air could be trapped and held still. The mountain men used pine bough beds for sleeping, not just because they were soft, but because they held warmth. And dried pine needles, Elijah reasoned, would do the same thing, but even better. They'd pack tighter, create more air pockets, and they wouldn't compress as much under weight. But here's where Elijah's idea went from clever to crazy, from something that made sense to something that would have other trappers shaking their heads and calling him a fool. He wasn't going to just scatter pine needles under his floor and hope for the best. He was going to rebuild the floor itself, and he was going to do it in a way that no one he'd ever met had done before. He was going to create a double floor with a space in between, and he was going to fill that space with something that would trap thousands upon thousands of tiny pockets of air. On a morning in late February, when the temperature had climbed all the way up to 15 degrees below zero, which felt almost balmy after the stretch of 40 below nights, Elijah began his work. He started by pulling up half his floorboards, the half that covered the sleeping area of his cabin, the part where the cold had been most dangerous. The boards came up easily enough, though the nails fought him, brittled by the cold. Beneath them were the joists, solid and level, resting on their foundation stones, and beneath that the earth, frozen solid, radiating its bone-deep cold up toward him like an open grave. Elijah's plan was precise, thought through during those long nights of planning. First, he gathered pine needles, not just a few baskets worth, but massive quantities. He spent an entire day moving through the forest with his largest pack basket, pushing snow aside, scraping up the thick mats of needles from beneath the pines. He filled the basket, hauled it back to the cabin, dumped it, and went back for more, again and again. The work kept him warm, at least, and by nightfall he had a pile of dried needles in his cabin that reached nearly to his waist. But needles alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to be contained, needed to be held in place so they wouldn't compact too much, wouldn't shift and settle, and lose their air-trapping ability. Elijah needed to create compartments, little boxes that would hold the needles and maintain their loft. And for that, he had to split more wood. Thin pieces this time, laths that would run perpendicular to his joists, creating a grid pattern, a framework of small rectangular cells. It took him 3 days to prepare all the materials. 3 days of splitting thin boards, of gathering needles, of thinking through every step of what he was about to do. And during those 3 days, he slept on the half of the floor that was still intact, and he noticed something interesting. Even with half the floor torn up, even with that massive gap exposing the frozen earth beneath, his feet actually felt slightly warmer at night, because now there was air movement, circulation, and the heat from his fire, instead of trying to penetrate straight down through the floorboards into the cold earth, was moving around the cabin, finding all the spaces it could fill. It was a small thing, but it told Elijah his theory was sound. Air was the answer. Trapped, still air. The actual construction was meticulous work. Elijah started by laying down a base layer, thin split boards that he nailed directly to the tops of his joists, creating a new, lower floor about 3 inches below where the original floorboards had been. This would be the bottom of his air pocket, the barrier between the frozen earth and the insulation he was about to install. Then came the grid work. He nailed thin laths perpendicular to the joists, spacing them about 6 inches apart, creating a lattice of small rectangular cells. Each cell was roughly 6 inches by the width between joists, maybe 14 inches. These cells would hold the pine needles, would keep them from shifting and compacting into useless mats. Then came the needles themselves. Elijah worked methodically, filling each cell completely, packing the needles in firmly, but not so tight that he crushed out all the air spaces. He'd take a double handful of needles, place them in a cell, press them down gently, add more, press again, until the cell was full right up to the top of the laths. The cabin filled with the sharp, clean scent of pine, and for the first time in months, Elijah felt something that might have been hope. When all the cells were packed, when he'd used every pine needle he'd gathered, and then gone out to gather 2 more loads to finish the job, Elijah began laying the top layer. This was the trickiest part, because these boards would be the actual floor he'd walk on, and they needed to be solid, level, and properly supported. He laid them perpendicular to the original joists, so they'd rest on top of the grid of laths. He nailed them down carefully, making sure each board was secure but not driven so tight that it compressed the pine needle layer below. When he was done, he had a floor that looked almost identical to the one he'd torn up, except it was now 3 inches higher than it had been before. 3 inches of trapped air and pine needles between his feet and the frozen earth. Elijah completed the work on March 7th. He remembered the date because it was the day another blizzard rolled in, one of those late winter storms that came with howling wind and driving snow that turned the whole world white. Perfect timing. If his floor was going to work, it would be tested immediately under the worst conditions. That first night was revelation. Elijah kept his fire burning as he always did, but he didn't feed it constantly the way he'd been doing through February. He let it die down to coals, wanted to see what would happen when the cabin cooled. And as the hours passed, as the blizzard raged outside and the temperature in the cabin dropped from warmth to merely cool, Elijah sat on his bunk and realized something extraordinary. His feet were comfortable. Not warm exactly, but not painfully cold either. They felt the way feet were supposed to feel in a cool room, present and functional, but not demanding his constant attention. He stood up, walked around the cabin, felt the floor beneath his moccasins. It was cool, yes, but not cold. Not that bone-deep, penetrating cold that had plagued him all winter. It felt like walking on a floor in autumn before the real cold had set in. He lay down to sleep that night without wrapping his feet in extra layers, just his normal wool socks and his moccasins. And when he woke in the morning, his feet were still comfortable. No numbness, no pain, no cold radiating up from below. The blizzard was still raging, and when Elijah opened his door to check on the weather, he was met with a wall of wind-driven snow and cold that took his breath away. But inside his cabin, with his fire rebuilt and blazing, the floor stayed comfortable. The cold outside couldn't reach him anymore. It was stopped at that layer of air and pine needles, defeated by something as simple as trapped air and forest debris. Over the following weeks, as winter finally began its grudging retreat, as the days grew imperceptibly longer, and the worst of the blizzards gave way to merely cold, clear weather, Elijah tested his new floor against every condition nature could throw at it. There were nights when the temperature dropped to 50 below, nights so cold that the trees in the forest cracked like rifle shots as the sap froze and expanded. On those nights, Elijah kept his fire burning, but even when it died down to embers, his feet stayed comfortable. The floor never got painfully cold. There were days of howling wind, when the gusts shook his cabin and forced icy air through every tiny gap in the walls and door. But the cold couldn't come up through his floor anymore. It was stopped, blocked, insulated away. And there was something else, something Elijah hadn't anticipated but quickly came to appreciate. His feet, which had been hovering on the edge of serious frostbite, began to heal. The white, waxy patches on his toes faded back to normal color. The cracks in his heels closed and sealed. The constant ache that had been his companion all winter gradually faded away. By the time April arrived and the first real thaw began, Elijah's feet were healthy again, functional, ready for the spring trapping season. The floor had literally saved his feet, and probably his life. But here's what made Elijah's floor design truly remarkable, truly worthy of the word genius, even though he'd never used that word himself. It wasn't just that it solved the winter cold problem, it was that it did so in a way that worked with the natural principles of heat and cold rather than fighting against them. A thicker floor without airspace would have helped, but only marginally, because wood itself isn't that great an insulator. And it would have required massive amounts of timber, more than one man could reasonably process alone. Elijah's design used minimal materials, things that were freely available even in winter, and it multiplied their effectiveness by understanding and exploiting the insulating properties of trapped air. And when summer came, Elijah discovered the second benefit of his design. Remember how his cabin had been oppressively hot in the summers before? Well, that double floor with its airspace worked both ways. In summer, when the sun baked down and the earth below the cabin finally warmed up, that layer of air and pine needles prevented the heat from the ground from radiating up into the cabin. The floor stayed cool, relatively speaking, and the cabin was noticeably more comfortable than it had been the previous summer. The same principle that kept the winter cold out also kept the summer heat down. It was, in its own simple way, a masterpiece of practical engineering. Now Elijah wasn't a fool. He knew that other trappers, when they heard about his floor, would think he was crazy. Spending days rebuilding a floor in the middle of winter, filling the space under the floorboards with pine needles, it sounded insane. It sounded like the kind of thing a man who'd been alone in the mountains too long might do, the kind of elaborate project a mind slowly losing its grip on reality might conceive. And when he did eventually tell other trappers about it, at the summer rendezvous that year, the reactions were exactly what he'd expected. Skepticism, amusement, some outright laughter. Why go to all that trouble when you could just wear more socks and keep your fire burning? But here's the thing about the frontier. Results spoke louder than theories, and by the next winter, 3 other trappers had rebuilt their cabin floors using variations of Elijah's design. By the winter after that, a dozen more had done the same. They didn't all use pine needles. Some experimented with dried grass, gathered in autumn before the snows came. Some used bark, shredded fine. One enterprising trapper even used moss, packed into his airspace and left to dry. The specific material mattered less than the principle. What mattered was the airspace, the compartmentalization, the understanding that insulation wasn't about thick walls or massive fireplaces, but about trapping air and keeping it still. Elijah's design spread through the mountain man community the way good ideas always spread, in the wilderness slowly and organically, through demonstration rather than explanation. Men would visit each other's cabins, would feel the difference in the floors, would see that Elijah and the others who'd adopted his method had healthier feet, burned less firewood, lived more comfortably, and slowly, reluctantly at first. Then, with growing enthusiasm, the design became standard practice. Not everywhere and not all at once, but enough that by the 1840s, the double floor with trapped air insulation was a known technique, a recognized method, part of the accumulated wisdom of how to survive in the high country. And that spreading of knowledge, that sharing of hard-won wisdom, that was crucial, because here's what people forget about the frontier. It wasn't really about individuals being tough enough or skilled enough to survive alone. It was about communities, even scattered communities of fiercely independent men, sharing what they learned. A technique that worked, a design that saved lives that got passed along. Sometimes the sharing was verbal, around a campfire or in a trading post. Sometimes it was visual, one man seeing another man's solution and adapting it to his own needs. But always, it was about learning, adapting, improving. The frontier demanded constant innovation, constant adjustment. The man who stuck rigidly to the way things had always been done was the man who froze to death in his cabin or starved in his camp. The man who observed, who learned, who adapted. That was the man who survived to trap another season. Elijah Crain trapped the Yellowstone country for another 11 years. He never got rich from it. The fur trade was already beginning its long decline by the time he arrived, and by the late 1840s, the heyday of the mountain man was over. But he survived those 11 years with his feet intact, his body healthy, his mind sharp. He survived winters that killed other men, and he did it in part because he'd paid attention, because he'd observed, because he'd been willing to do something that seemed crazy to solve a problem that was very real. In 1848, when the fur trade finally collapsed completely, Elijah made his way out to Oregon country, settled on a land claim, built a house. And that house had a double floor with airspace between the layers. Of course it did. Old habits, especially ones that work, die hard. Now there are practical lessons here, technical details about construction and insulation that are worth understanding, because they're not just historical curiosities. They're based on principles of physics that work just as well today as they did in 1837. Trapped air is one of the best insulators available, better than most solid materials. A quarter-inch of still air has about the same insulating value as 3/4 of an inch of wood. That's why hollow walls work better than solid walls. That's why double-pane windows are so much more effective than single-pane. That's why down sleeping bags and puffy jackets are warmer than solid leather or wool. It's the air trapped between the feathers or fibers that does the insulating, not the feathers or fibers themselves. But the air has to be trapped. It has to be held still, divided into small pockets. If you create a big empty space, the air will circulate, will carry heat from warm areas to cold areas through convection, and you lose most of the insulating benefit. That's why Elijah's grid system was crucial. By dividing his airspace into small cells, by packing each cell with material that created thousands of tiny air pockets, he prevented convection. He created dead air, still air, air that could only transfer heat through conduction, which is much slower than convection. The pine needles themselves weren't great insulators, but they didn't need to be. Their job was just to keep the air from moving, to maintain all those tiny pockets where air could be trapped and held still. The same principle applies to how you build today, whether it's a cabin in the woods or an addition on a house. The key isn't necessarily using the most high-tech materials or the most expensive insulation. The key is understanding how heat moves, understanding that air is your ally if you can trap it, and your enemy if you let it circulate. Modern foam insulation works on exactly the same principle as Elijah's pine needles. It's full of tiny air bubbles, thousands of them, each one trapping a pocket of air. Fiberglass insulation works the same way, trapping air between the fibers. Even that crinkled space blanket that hikers carry works on the same principle, reflecting heat back while trapping a layer of still air against the body. And there's another lesson here, one that goes beyond just insulation, beyond just building techniques. It's about observation, about looking at the natural world not as something to conquer or endure, but as something to learn from. Elijah didn't invent insulation. Nature had been using it for millions of years. Animal fur works by trapping air. Bird feathers do the same thing. That's why ptarmigans can survive Arctic winters and why polar bears don't freeze on the ice. They've evolved systems for trapping air, for creating insulation. Elijah just observed what nature was already doing and found a way to apply those same principles to his cabin floor. This kind of observation, this willingness to look at how animals and plants solve problems, this was common among the successful frontiersmen. They watched how wolves moved through deep snow and learned to use snowshoes. They saw how bears chose den sites and learned where to build their own shelters for maximum protection from wind and cold. They noticed which plants the elk ate in early spring and learned which greens were safe for humans to eat after a long winter of dried meat. The frontier was a vast university, and the tuition was paid in attention and humility. The man who thought he knew everything, who believed his civilized knowledge was superior to wilderness wisdom, that man usually didn't last long. But the man who watched, who learned, who adapted, he thrived. There is something profound in that, something that goes beyond just survival techniques. It's about approaching problems with humility and curiosity instead of assumption and rigidity. Elijah could have spent that entire winter cursing his fate, complaining about the cold, suffering through it with gritted teeth and the belief that suffering was just part of life in the mountains. Many men did exactly that. They accepted discomfort as inevitable, as the price you paid for living free in wild country. And they paid for that acceptance with frostbitten feet, with shortened lives, with a harder existence than was necessary. But Elijah didn't accept it. He questioned it. He asked why it had to be that way. And then he observed, he thought, and he experimented. He was willing to try something that seemed crazy, something that other men would laugh at, because he understood that sometimes the difference between a crazy idea and a brilliant one is just whether or not it works, and he was willing to put in the effort to find out. 3 days of tearing up his floor and rebuilding it in the middle of winter, while already struggling with frost-bitten feet and limited energy. That took courage. It took faith in his own observations and reasoning. It took a willingness to bet his survival on an untested theory. And that's really what made the mountain men, the trappers, the frontiersmen who succeeded. Not just their toughness, though they were tough. Not just their skills, though they were skilled. But their willingness to think, to experiment, to try new approaches when the old ones weren't working. The frontier demanded innovation because it was constantly presenting new challenges, situations that the old ways from back east weren't designed to handle. The man who could adapt, who could observe and learn and try new things, he was the man who survived. The man who stuck rigidly to tradition, who did things a certain way because that's how they'd always been done, he was the man who ended up buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the high country, forgotten by everyone except maybe his bones scattered by the animals. Elijah's floor design, his crazy idea that turned out to be brilliant, became part of that accumulated wisdom that allowed men to not just survive in the frontier, but to live there with some degree of comfort. And that's the final lesson, the one that pulls all the others together. Survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about maintaining the quality of life that makes survival worthwhile. A man can survive on minimal food, in brutal discomfort, suffering through each day. But that's not really living. That's just existing. The real achievement isn't just staying alive. It's staying healthy, staying comfortable enough to enjoy the life you've chosen, to appreciate the wild country you're living in, instead of just enduring it. Elijah's floor gave him that. It gave him feet that worked, a cabin that was livable, a winter that was bearable, instead of an ordeal of constant suffering. And when he shared that knowledge, when other trappers adopted his design and improved on it and passed it along to others, it raised the standard of living for everyone in that community. It made the frontier more accessible, more survivable. It meant that men could stay in the high country longer, could trap more successfully, could build lives instead of just surviving seasons. And that pattern repeated itself across the frontier in 1,000 different ways. Someone would figure out a better way to tan a hide, and that knowledge would spread. Someone would discover that a particular plant made excellent cordage, and everyone would start using it. Someone would develop more efficient trap design, or a better way to cache supplies, or a technique for keeping meat through the summer. Each innovation, each improvement, each bit of hard-won wisdom added to the collective knowledge that allowed the frontier to be settled, to be lived in, to be transformed from a deadly wilderness into a home. The frontier wasn't tamed by guns and axes alone. It was tamed by knowledge, by observation, by men like Elijah Crane who paid attention to the world around them and figured out how to work with nature instead of just fighting against it. The double floor with its trapped air and pine needles was just one small piece of that larger puzzle, one small victory in the endless campaign to make the wilderness livable. But it was an important piece. It was the kind of practical, simple, elegant solution that made all the difference between a winter of suffering and a winter of relative comfort, between feet that healed and feet that had to be amputated, between a man who could trap another season and a man who had to give up and head back east. The knowledge that Elijah gained, that cold wisdom he earned through observation and experimentation and 3 days of backbreaking work in February, that knowledge is still relevant today. Not because we still build cabins with pine needle insulation, though you certainly could if you wanted to, but because the principle behind it, the understanding of how air and insulation work, that's timeless. Whether you're building a tiny house, insulating a van for winter camping, or just trying to keep your home more comfortable and your heating bills lower, the lessons are the same. Trap air. Keep it still. Divide it into small pockets. Use whatever materials you have available that will do the job. Don't assume the standard way is the only way or the best way. Observe, think, experiment. Be willing to try something that seems crazy if your reasoning tells you it will work. That's the legacy of men like Elijah Crane, not just the specific techniques they developed, though those are valuable, but the mindset they embodied, the willingness to question, to observe, to adapt, the courage to try something new even when others think you're foolish, the humility to learn from nature, from animals, from people who came before, the persistence to see a project through even when it's difficult, even when you're already exhausted and struggling. These qualities, these habits of mind, these were what allowed the frontier to be settled, and they're what allow any of us to solve problems, to improve our circumstances, to make our lives better. Elijah Crane's double floor kept his feet warm through the worst blizzards the Rockies could throw at him. But more than that, it proved a principle. It showed that survival isn't just about toughness and endurance. It's about observation and innovation. It's about being willing to learn from the world around you and apply those lessons in practical ways. It's about understanding that the old ways aren't always the best ways, and that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem is sitting right there in front of you, in a pile of pine needles on the forest floor, just waiting for someone to see it clearly and understand what it means. That cabin on the headwaters of the Yellowstone stood until the 1860s, when a fire took it. But by then, dozens of other cabins had been built using Elijah's floor design, or variations of it. The knowledge had spread, had been absorbed into the general practice of mountain building. It became one more piece of frontier wisdom, one more tool in the kit of survival techniques that allowed men to live in places that would have killed them otherwise. And isn't that the whole story of the frontier, really? The slow accumulation of knowledge, hard-won through observation and experiment, shared and passed along, building a foundation of practical wisdom that made the impossible possible. We look back at those mountain men, those trappers and frontiersmen, and we see them as almost superhuman, as tough beyond anything we could imagine. And they were tough, no question. But their real strength wasn't just in their muscles or their endurance. It was in their minds, in their willingness to learn, to adapt, to try new things, in their ability to look at a problem that seemed unsolvable and find a solution in the world around them. Elijah Crane's feet didn't stay warm because he was tougher than the cold. They stayed warm because he was smart enough to figure out how to keep the cold away. And that's the real lesson. That's the wisdom worth preserving. Not just the specific techniques, but the approach, the mindset, the willingness to observe and think and act. The frontier taught hard lessons, but it taught good ones. And the men who learned those lessons, who paid attention and adapted and shared what they learned, they're the ones who not only survived but thrived. They're the ones who built something lasting, something that others could learn from and build upon. Elijah Crane's floor was just one small contribution to that larger edifice of frontier knowledge. But it was a good contribution. It solved a real problem in a clever way. It made life better for the man who invented it and for the men who learned from him. And in the end, isn't that what all knowledge should do? Make life better, make survival easier, turn suffering into comfort and impossibility into possibility. The cold came up through the floor first. That's what Elijah learned. But he also learned that the cold could be stopped, could be defeated, by something as simple as trapped air and pine needles, by observation and thought, by the willingness to try something new. That knowledge kept his feet warm. But more importantly, it proved that even in the hardest conditions, even when facing problems that seemed insurmountable, there was always a solution if you were willing to look for it, willing to learn from the world around you, willing to think and experiment and act. That's frontier wisdom. That's the legacy of men like Elijah Crane, not just how they survived, but how they thought. And that's a legacy worth preserving, worth learning from, worth carrying forward into whatever wilderness we face in our own lives.